Good afternoon. I am Heather Herring, the Education Manager at the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. I want to warmly welcome you to our summer webinar series. And today we will think about clothing textiles differently. Do you need professional credits? You can receive 1 hour of professional development credit by participating in this live webinar and completing the short survey at the end. Our webinars are being recorded and will be made available for those who registered. Continue your learning with these webinars all summer long. Please visit our new website at nrrarecycles.org for additional information. Here's some information on our webinars. For recycling facility operators, we have our operator track webinars from which to choose from. We are nearing the end of our webinar series, and our recorded webinars are available on our website's Summer Webinar Series page. As for our educators, administrators, and community members, we have our community track webinars. We've separated our webinars according to probable interest groups, but all NRRA members and not yet members are welcome to participate in any and all of our webinar offerings. I'd like to set the table for this GoToWebinar. Webinar participants will not be able to be heard by the presenters or other participants during this presentation. If you cannot hear the presenters' voices, please click on the audio arrow in your control panel and choose computer audio. If that doesn't work, select the phone call option and follow the directions. We hope that you'll ask questions, and our presenter will do his best to answer your questions as time allows. Click on the questions block in the control panel and type in your questions. And please keep questions short and to the point. I would also like to bring your attention to, you will have an email after the webinar and receive a PDF copy of the presentation. Here's a little bit about NRRA, Northeast Resource Recovery Association. We are a recycling nonprofit. We have 400 members, primarily municipalities, and we were founded nearly 40 years ago. So what do? We do cooperative marketing and purchasing. We enable communities to manage their own recycling programs, and we offer over 40 programs, including single stream and municipal solid waste. We connect sellers of recyclables to purchasers. We provide education and technical assistance through workshops, facility tours, an annual conference, webinars like these, technical assistance, and a school club with virtual school workshops this year. And now I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Joe Whitten, who is the founder and CEO of Apparel Impact, New England's fastest growing textile recovery and recycling company, with customers ranging from Easterseals, Mobil, and hundreds of schools, towns, and businesses. On behalf of NRRA, I'd like to welcome you to the summer webinar series and turn this presentation over to you. Welcome, Joe.
Welcome, thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Certainly.
So, well, thanks everyone for joining. I definitely appreciate it. Thank you for your time. I know that the last 4 months for all of us have been a little bit tricky, let's say. So I definitely appreciate you making time to talk about textiles and clothing and how we really need to start thinking about them much differently. We'll go to slide 2. Just to kind of go over what we'll be doing today. Pretty simple outline. Today, really what I want to talk about is textile waste and textile recycling. A little bit about what the problems are, the effects they have on our environment, on our communities, and to go over the solutions, because believe it or not, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of solutions that we'll talk about today to really kind of curb the issues that we see with textile waste, and I really think that the outcome can be much better, and I'm believing that too. So pretty simple outline, but I'll go over a lot of facts in regards to what the issues are, what the effects on the environment and the economy are, and then the solutions as well. So we can jump right into slide 3. So I've been accused of being a little too simplistic in my PowerPoints and slides, so please excuse me if you feel the same. I try to make it as simple as possible, and usually when I make this presentation, it is in person. But of course, with what's going on out there, it's probably better that we're behind the computer screens, which I'm sure we're all a little tired of, but we got to do what we got to do to stay healthy and protect the community. So I would encourage you to ask questions. I know that usually in-person presentations, there's quite a few of them, so don't be shy. And I'll start right in. Textile waste and clothing waste and shoes and accessories like backpacks and things like that are not really something we think about as being an environmental problem, an environmental hazard. It's not really at the forefront of our minds. It's not really at the forefront of the minds of the people actually in the environmental industries, believe it or not. Over the last 40 or 50 years, it's become a really big issue. It's become an issue really throughout the country and throughout the world. And one of the biggest reasons why is fast fashion, is our clothing themselves. It's a $2.5 trillion industry annually, and it continues to grow. What they expect is that it could be a $3 trillion industry by 2025, believe it or not. And it's constantly growing. And when I say fast fashion, what I really mean is clothing manufacturers. We have access to more new clothing than we've ever had access to, primarily because the ability to manufacture clothing has become cheap. It's become easy. We've transferred jobs to overseas, to developed countries, to where the labor is cheap and they make clothing, and so we have access to fashion, fast fashion, in the amounts that we've never seen before, which makes it less expensive, more affordable, and so we end up buying more. And that's why they're anticipating the growth of the industry to reach, 3 trillion in a matter of 5 years. Right now, we're at 2.5 trillion. Believe it or not, textiles is the 5th most polluting industry globally in the world, the 5th. And it's behind energy and transportation, but it's up there. It's an industry that really is causing a lot of issues from an environmental standpoint. And one of the issues that we see with textiles and clothing is the dyes themselves, the color dyes that are used within the textiles. The main damages caused by the textile industry itself are when the dyes are actually discharging into water bodies, which normally constitute about 80% of total emissions produced by the textile industry. They cause not only aesthetic damage, the way that the river looks or the ponds look or the ocean looks, but it also actually prevents penetration of light going through the water itself, which actually leads to dissolved oxygen levels, which affects everything. It affects the entire aquatic life that live within the rivers and the water supplies. So it's not only damaging the aesthetic appeal of our rivers, but it's damaging the environment. It's damaging the aquatic life, the ecosystem that exists really all around us. Textile dyes also act as a toxic or a carcinogenic agent. It pollutes the entire food chain, where we actually are seeing organisms show higher levels of contamination year over year. It's not getting better. And when it comes to water pollution, the textile dyes, along with a large number of industrial pollutants, become highly toxic. And we're seeing that it's related to environmental degradation and various diseases in animals, which also transfer to humans, if you can believe it or not. When it comes to the textile industry, it's interesting because as Americans, it's difficult for us to really see the effects sometimes. Most of us live in, cities or small towns where there's not a lot of manufacturing plants of clothing. Most of that has actually been shipped overseas. We actually don't make anywhere near the amount of clothing or manufacture the amount of textiles that we once did. And what happens is when it gets shipped overseas, a lot of us have probably seen the 2020 reports or ABC News or some of the journalists that have written stories on this. But what happens is when we ship out the garment industry, when we ship out the textile manufacturing to other countries, what ends up happening is laborers become exploited. It becomes an issue. So although fast fashion is great for, let's say, my 16-year-old daughter who loves Forever 21 and loves going to the mall and getting a brand new shirt for $7, let's say, which I'm sure some of you can relate. That sounds great. It feels great, right? We're getting a brand new piece of clothing for $7 and hey, it's got a tag on it and wonderful. The problem is that when we look at that piece of clothing, when we look at that pair of shoes, what we really don't realize is that the reason it's become affordable is because it was shipped to a developed country, which, great, they have jobs now. Now they're manufacturing clothing, but the problem is that most corporations, not only American corporations, but all sorts of companies across the globe, exploit the actual labor market that create these pieces of clothing. And the garment industry is and has historically been one of the most female-dominated industries in the world. 70% of all garment workers in China are women. In Bangladesh, 85% of all garment workers are women. And in Cambodia, which has recently become a large textile manufacturer of our clothing here in the US and in Europe, 90% are all women, and all of them are being exploited when it comes to the amount of hours they're working and the amount of money that they're making. I read a report a few weeks ago by the International Labor Organization, and they actually estimate that 170 million workers are engaged in child labor within this industry alone on a global scale. With many of them making the textiles and garments to really satisfy the demands of consumers in Europe and the United States. And so it's really becoming a huge issue. Fast fashion it's pushing companies to find even cheaper sources of labor, right? So they need to compete on prices. And the way that they do that is by finding low-wage workers in other countries that are not as developed as, let's say, the United States or Europe. And the cheap labor is freely available in many of those countries. And it's becoming a big problem that really is not being solved because of the demand we see in Western countries and in the US and in Europe. From an environmental aspect, what fast fashion does is also from the amount of clean water that's used. Many of us don't know, but if you believe it, 700 gallons of water is used to manufacture one t-shirt. I'm going to let that sink in. 700 gallons of water is used to manufacture one t-shirt. And I say that with, I know it for myself, and I assume the folks here on this presentation, most of the world does not even have access to clean drinking water. And what fast fashion has done is, instead of providing ways where we can talk about, getting clean water to people who don't have it, instead we're using 700 gallons of it to make just one t-shirt. And so it's a really, really big issue. Fast fashion is one of the reasons why we have seen textile, clothing, and shoe waste go from, in the 1970s, 3% of total waste within the country, within the United States, to now topping 8% of total waste throughout our entire country. And we need to think about that. I know it's difficult when we use numbers and percentages, but 8% of total waste is our clothing and our shoes. It's a huge, huge issue. And it's sad because really it doesn't need to be like that. There are ways that we can actually provide solutions to where we don't need to see that number increase. It's grown 300% in less than 10 years, the amount of clothing waste we've seen. And that's directly because of fast fashion and our ability to access clothing at a cheaper price. So I'll move on to the next slide. That's a little bit about fast fashion and kind of the issues that we're seeing throughout the industry. In regards to that 8% number, just to kind of give you an idea, the EPA, they did a few studies over the last few years because what they started to get reports from towns and cities and states about their waste is that the actual textile waste is skyrocketing. 11.1 million tons in 2017 were dumped in landfills, and that's compared to 1.7 million in 1970. So in literally, 30 to 40 years, it's increased almost 1,000% in the amount of textile waste that we've seen, which now total waste is 8% of everything within the country. So it's pretty crazy. Those are crazy numbers to think about. I know it doesn't have as big of an impact as we think when we talk about percentages and numbers, but really it's a big issue. And I run Apparel Impact, and we service a lot of towns and a lot of cities across New England and across New York. And in speaking with a lot of the transfer station managers and a lot of the city managers, clothing is a huge issue. They don't know what to do with it. There are definitely solutions to it, but it's becoming more and more of an issue. And so that's kind of what motivated the EPA to start doing a lot of these studies. Of course, when it comes to the problem, most of the time we need to look at ourselves, right? People. 11.2 million tons thrown out, like I mentioned, in landfills, and that was just in 2017. It's actually grown since then. In 2019, last year alone, the average American threw out 70 pounds of clothing on average per person within this country. 70 pounds is a lot of clothing, and it averages about 127 pieces of clothing or accessories like backpacks and shoes per person that were thrown out. The other issue is that we are buying new. We are going to retail stores and promoting the fast fashion and supporting the fast fashion industry. And the average American spends around $160, or the average household rather, I'm sorry, spends about $160 per month on clothing, shoes, and accessories. And the average family spends, I think, around $1,800 per year on clothing. And that does not include shoes. The average family spends about $400 a year on clothing. It's a household of four. And so it just gradually gets worse and worse because we're continuously buying new. The average American buys 37 new items a year in clothing. And that's great because it says, well, the economy must be doing good because we're able to buy new clothing and new shoes and support the family, and that is good. That is good to see. It would only be good though if all of us were recycling the clothing that we don't use. And unfortunately for us, there's only about 16% of us in this country that are recycling our clothing and recycling our shoes and backpacks and things. The other 85% of all clothing that's purchased in this country is thrown in the trash. It's discarded. It's thrown into landfills to be incinerated or buried. And it's a really, really big problem. It's what's growing that figure of 8% to be to 10% in a few years, matter of time, of total waste. The average lifetime of a piece of clothing is about 3 years. So those 37 new items that we buy every year, in about 3 years, all 37 of them are going to end up in a landfill somewhere. And what's most sad about that is that nearly 100% of those items that we buy every year are recyclable. They have a solution. They don't need to end up buried in the ground. They don't need to end up in polluting our environment. They don't need to end up in the trash. The annual environmental impact of one household in America when it comes to the clothing is equivalent to the water needed to fill 1,000 bathtubs. And if we bring it to the carbon emissions, it's the equivalent of driving an average car for 6,000 miles a year. And that's just the new clothing that we buy. 1,000 bathtubs or driving a car for 6,000 miles per year. If the average life of clothing was extended by just 3 months, so 3 years, let's put it 3 years and 3 months, it would reduce carbon and water footprints as well as waste generation by 10%. The recycling of 2 million tons of clothing per year equates to taking 1 million cars off of the United States streets and towns in our communities. And that's just recycling 2 million tons. We generate close to 12 million tons. So it's a really big issue. Unfortunately, we are a part of it, but that doesn't need to be that way all the time. I think that there's a huge change coming. I think this is a subject that's on the frame of minds of a lot of people, not only in America, but in Europe as well and in China. There are a lot of companies, as I'm sure we've seen, that are starting to take responsibility for the amount of clothing they're manufacturing and trying to find new and inventive ways to recycle them. And that's awesome. But really what it comes down to is, what are we doing in our own homes? Those 37 new pieces of clothes that we bought, are they being recycled? The 70 pounds that we're throwing out, are we instead choosing to place them in a recycling bin that's located in the community, or donating them to Goodwill or a nonprofit, or giving them as a hand-me-down to a family member or a homeless shelter or something of that nature? Anything and everything to make sure that the 85% of clothing is not ending up in landfills. It's not only a problem from an environmental standpoint, but it's also a problem for the towns and cities that we reside in, because it costs us a lot of money to discard that. And so I'll go to the next slide, and I'll kind of talk about the effects a little bit. There's a lot of effects. There's environmental effects, there's economical effects, there's all sorts of really negative effects and global harm that we see our clothing and textiles produce. A few of them I do want to talk about, because it's good to know kind of what happens when the clothes get to the landfills. Of the 85% of all the clothes that we're throwing out, they're getting to the landfills. And so it's good to understand what happens when they get there and what they're doing to our communities and our environment, because it's not always, like I said at the beginning, it's not always at the forefront of our mind. We don't really think about clothing all the time, unless it's like a favorite t-shirt or something like that. So when it comes to decomposition, non-biodegradable clothes are manufactured with what we would call synthetic textiles. A lot of us have seen that lately over the last 10 years, a lot of sportswear. We've seen, I know myself, I'm guilty of it. I wear a lot of Under Armour or Nike pants that's manufactured from a spandex or synthetic textile, which includes polyester and nylon and rayon. The problem is that pair of pants, if I were to throw my pair of pants out, I was done with them, they're not in that great a condition, I don't want to wear them anymore. It takes up to 100 years for that one pair of pants to become biodegradable within the landfill. 100 years, it's 4 American generations before that one pair of pants disappears. And the problem is there's so much more use for it rather than just throwing it out, other than the environmental impact. The other problems is when it comes to decomposition, decomposing clothing releases methane and a lot of harmful greenhouse gas, and a significant contributor to global warming, believe it or not. There are dyes and chemicals in these fabrics and other components of clothing and shoes that can leach into the soil once it reaches the landfill. It contaminates both the surface and the groundwater. It gets to the groundwater eventually. EPA has done studies, as well as a lot of independent organizations, on the effects of textile waste. They have seen that it has contaminated both surface and groundwater in more than 100 occasions across this country. And we're not even talking about the space problem. If there's any transfer station managers or town managers or anyone in the waste industry that's on this presentation, you know that space is not, space is a commodity. It's something that's very difficult to come by. And there are a lot of dyes and chemicals in the fabric and other components that are leaching into the soil. It contaminates both the surface and groundwater. And why do we need this here? If we're running out of space for the other trash and there's a solution for the clothing, why are we continuously dumping it out? There's a solution for it. We don't need to do that. And 11 million tons of textiles every year clogs up approximately 126 million cubic yards of landfill space. And that's 1 year, if you can believe it. I mean, that's a lot of room that we could probably use for other things. When it gets to landfills, textile mills generate 1/5 of the world's industrial water pollution. That's 1/5 textile mills. They use 20,000 different chemicals just to manufacture new clothing, and many of them are carcinogenic. Chinese textile factories, which Chinese are a large producer of new clothing and new textiles. Their factories alone produce about 3 billion tons of soot. Air pollution, which is linked to a lot of respiratory and heart disease in the countries that manufacture them. Excuse me. We get to water pollution. The wastewater usually contains a lot of carcinogens, even lead sometimes, and many other chemicals that could cause severe health problems and disease among humans. The air pollution is a huge issue as well. Believe it or not, in the manufacturing plants, you know, when I talk about global harm, it's not just about the environmental aspect, but there are a lot of high noise levels that cause psychological effects of the people that are actually working in these factories, believe it or not, because the machines are so loud that it actually causes not only psychological effects, but physical damage. What a lot of scientists and health experts are seeing is that it causes anxiety, increased pulse rate, and something like 20% of all people across the globe, whether they're in the United States or out in another country, 20% of them have hearing loss. And that's almost 1/4 of the people that work in manufacturing plants have hearing loss, which is a huge issue. And so that's primarily because we're buying so many new clothing, you know, and there's a way around that. When it comes to toxic waste, the textile industry produces waste in the form of wastewater effluent. The wastewater effluent contains solvents which are mostly organic, along with used soils and coloring agents. And they become toxic and hazardous as well. So there are a lot of issues, and I know I'm spewing out a lot of different information. I know it's a lot, but I really kind of just wanted to bring to the forefront the issues that we're seeing with clothing, new clothing and manufacturing and fast fashion, and what the harms are. Because it's not only about when we buy the new shirt or buy the new pants, but it's about what happens after when we're done with them. Because the issue that we are seeing in this industry is that although our clothing has become more affordable, which is great, it is not made as well as it once was. The quality is not as good. And so it does not last as long. And when it does not last as long, what we end up finding is that 85% of us end up throwing it in the trash, which then cause all of the issues that we just talked about. So I'll go to the next slide. That's kind of it for the effects. But here's my favorite part. We're here to talk about the solution. And the best part of this is that there are so many solutions, and we do not need to, you know, worry, because there are a lot of solutions that we can talk about. The first solution is recycling. We do it with so many other materials, whether it be plastics or metals or anything of that nature. Recycling clothing can be something that can be at the forefront of our minds, something that we do on a daily basis. It can be something that we make a habit of. There are numerous opportunities to recycle our clothing. As an example, Apparel Impact, the company that I own, there are lots of us all over the country that provide recycling bins in communities, at schools, at town offices, at transfer stations, at places of business that are accessible all day long, that you can recycle your clothing with. And that alone right there makes a huge difference, but only 15% of us right now are doing that. And so there's a lot of room for improvement. But the good thing is that it's really easy to do, because on your way to work or on your way to get gas or on your way to the grocery store, you have the bag in your house and you make it a habit to fill it as you go. And once you're out, you find a recycling bin and you can deposit the clothing and shoes and accessories right in there to be recycled and repurposed or reused, because 85% of all clothing that ends up in landfills can actually be reworn again. It's not in bad enough condition, whether it be for an American or someone else around the world. It may not have been in good enough condition for us at the time, but the truth is 80 to 85% of all clothing that ends up in landfills in this country is actually in good enough shape to be reworn and reused. It goes right to this is you can reuse and donate. You can reuse it for another purpose, or you can donate it. There are lots of nonprofits around all of our communities, churches who have church closets, or schools who have school closets for children who don't have the money to buy new clothing and they need used clothing. There's a lot of teachers that we work with across New England and across New York, really all across the Northeast, where, in speaking with them, they see it all the time, where kids will walk into school in December without a jacket on. Or a fifth grade teacher will notice that, one of the students is wearing the same pair of pants 5 days in a row. And they're kind of at the forefront of seeing the need for clothing even in our country. And the problem is that we're throwing out so much of it that there are people in our own backyard, in our own communities, that can use that clothing. So whether you donate it to a nonprofit or you recycle it with a clothing recycling company, or you utilize it as a hand-me-down, really we need to just be doing that rather than throwing it out. There are definite ways to recycle, reuse, and donate our clothing. And it doesn't take much time. You're already driving to the gas station or what have you, and it's making a big difference, believe it or not, from an environmental standpoint, an economical standpoint, and a community standpoint. One thing I would say, I don't know who's on this presentation or how many, but one thing I would say is that if you are in local government, or you have a relationship with local government, or you work for maybe a town or a transfer station, I would encourage you to really encourage whoever the decision makers are to really look at clothing differently. I know your transfer station managers and your waste station managers and the people there are seeing clothing. I know this for a fact because I've talked to hundreds of them across the country, and it's a huge issue. It's getting buried, incinerated, and there's other uses for it. So I would encourage you to talk with them to figure out a way to work with textile recyclers like Apparel Impact or others to provide this service, because there is no reason that they should end up in the landfill. We can divert them before they even get there. And it's really easy. Most of the time, there's no cost to local governments to do this. In fact, it saves money because you're not utilizing it to bury. It's not a weight that you have to bury. So you end up saving a lot of money in regards to working with textile recyclers. And really, we just need to be the difference. There's a way to do this, and it's pretty simple. Really, it's just kind of working together, supporting textile recyclers, supporting nonprofits that take clothes in. We have plenty of them, and all of them are taking in clothes and shoes. And I will say, I read a study a few years back. I think it was done by the EPA, if I'm not mistaken. It may have been done by another publication, so please excuse me if I got that wrong. But what it came to the conclusion of was, currently within the waste industry across the country, we employ a certain amount of people. And what they found was, if all Americans decided to recycle our clothing and shoes and accessories, it would actually create close to 770,000 good-paying jobs within the U.S., just within the clothing recycling industry alone. And that right there should be one of the biggest impacts, if anything, that I would say, because that's 770,000 good-paying jobs that don't exist right now, and they would exist if we just made a different choice. They would exist if we just decided to recycle our clothing and shoes. That's it. A small decision in each household would create 770,000 good-paying jobs within the clothing recycling industry. It would have an enormous impact on the environment. It would be the equivalent of taking millions of cars off of the road. It would be the equivalent of saving millions of gallons of water, and really be a huge difference in what we currently see. And so I would just encourage everyone, there are definite solutions. There are a lot of issues, but they all can be really solved. They all can be taken care of in a pretty simplistic way if we all just kind of work together and support what's currently out there as far as an infrastructure is concerned, and work on growing that. So with that, my presentation itself does not typically take up an hour, but I do encourage folks to ask questions. And I don't know if Heather has anything else to say, but I would certainly encourage questions at this time, or discussions, or anything of that nature. If I don't have an answer for you, I will get it for you. This is something I'm very passionate about. It's an industry that I've invested my life in. It's a company that I started 5 years ago, and really have dedicated to growing it. And we are blessed in a lot of ways. We are the fastest growing in the Northeast, but I want to become bigger, because I want to make a bigger difference in what we're doing, who we're working with, and the impact we're having on the environment. So with that, if there are questions, I would love to answer them. And thanks again for making time today.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe, for that wonderful presentation. I learned a bit, both numbers and effects of the textile industry. I do have one question. I know I talked to a lot of operators here at NRRA, and a lot of them have swap shops for items, and they might have an agreement with a bin for pickup for textiles. And the one thing I do hear about that, of course we want to keep that 8 to 10% of clothing weight out of the municipal solid waste. But the one question I get from operators is reliability of pickup. So they may have a bin on their site for clothing recycling, which is great, but then it fills up, and they don't have that particular company. There's a variety of companies that pick up, and so they can be frustrated by that. So they want to provide that service, but it's about reliability. I hear your point about making so many jobs in clothing recycling. So how do we get there? How do we get the operators to say, yes, I want that bin at my recycling center because I know it's being picked up and know the clothing is going to go to reuse?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. The textile recycling industry is not run as well as it should be, like most industries. I make this comparison when I'm talking to some folks, but sometimes when you go into a mechanic shop that's like locally owned, you do not want to, you don't want to sit down. It's dirty in there. The coffee looks like it's 10 days old. It's not run well. You don't even know if your car's getting fixed. And that's kind of what the textile industry is really like, which is what I'm trying to work on fixing, because some operators across the country aren't well run, or are not run by good people. And you can really say that about any industry, but I just know this industry really well, so I'm comfortable with saying that. So to your question, what I would typically do, and what we do with our over 600 customers across the Northeast, is I basically explain to them how we work. I basically explained to them the fact that their bins will be serviced every 5 to 7 days. There's a 24-hour number that they can call to get serviced. You know, you have to speak with whoever the operator or the service provider is and ask these types of questions. How often will it be serviced? What happens if it's not? Do you have a phone number that can be called? Is your information on the bin? So someone in the public that has a question can either email or call. And all of those answers, if you get answers like, well, we don't know yet, or, you know, I don't know, we'll be there when you call us. Those types of answers you want to stay away from. Just like in any other industry, there are bad actors. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that the companies you're working with are reputable, have been in the industry, and have a good reputation. There are other companies like Apparel Impact who have as many customers as us and as a good reputation. You know, we're not the only ones, but I definitely understand where you're coming from, because one of the ways that we grow is we get phone calls from people who might have other providers that say they're not doing that great of a job. And so, I guess it's just about doing the homework and asking the questions. But, you know, for myself and other providers, we have a way of doing business where it's every 5 to 7 days your service, there's a 24-hour phone number, and it's run well, and your service, and you have a good reputation. So I totally get you. That's not the first time I've heard that, but there are good providers out there for sure. And when it comes to swap shop, I will just, you mentioned it, we have over 20 transfer stations that also have swap shops. And both the swap shop organizers and the transfer station is happy to have us there. We do not compete with the swap shop. We encourage people to obviously go and get used clothing. That's one of the ways we're going to solve this problem. And so anything that's not used can be put into the recycling bin. And sometimes community members would rather just put it in there than the swap shop, and so they have a choice. And so just to encourage you in that.
Excellent. And then a follow-up question to that. I just happened to donate some clothing to an organization yesterday, but I know that there have been limits because of COVID-19, like everything else. At first, you know, some places were closed. Now you have to have an appointment to drop things off. Have you noticed limits during COVID-19, or has it been going business as usual?
So we've actually seen an increase of 20% of households recycling throughout the Northeast.
Yeah.
So it's only gotten better, which is great. I think it's because everyone's stuck home and bored out of their minds, so they can finally clean out the closet and go through the clothes that they haven't worn or seen in 5 years, which is awesome. So we've actually seen a really big increase, which has actually caused us to reevaluate our routes to make sure the bins are being serviced on time. And make sure that there's enough room in the bins. But yeah, we've seen an increase. You know, I know you had one question I think that came in, which is what does our company specifically do with the textile that it collects? And I can I don't know how much time we have left, but I can give you kind of a 2-minute description of kind of what the average industry looks like from that point, if you'd like.
Please do.
Okay, so textile recyclers like Apparel Impact and like many others, and even Goodwill and Savers and nonprofit collectors and nonprofit stores. So what typically happens is, like I mentioned in the presentation, 85% of all clothing that's either donated or recycled can be reused for its intended purpose. So it does not need to be recycled for another purpose or need to be reused for a wiping cloth or something of that nature. 80 to 85% can be reused. And so what recyclers do is, aside from diverting them from landfills and making sure that they're not being wasted in landfills, and aside from creating jobs within local communities for the drivers and all of that good stuff, we work with what's called clothing graders, and also nonprofit organizations that take in mass amounts of clothing. And so Clothing Grader, as an example, is a company, whether it be a nonprofit or for-profit, located within the United States, that will have a container of clothing shipped in and will go through each individual piece of clothing and will grade it A through C. Is this in the best condition, or is this in okay condition, or does this need to be recycled for another purpose? And those organizations then provide them to marketplaces, whether it be in the United States, or whether it be across the world in global markets, to where people are in need of used clothing to purchase. And so that is kind of the life cycle chain of how clothing recyclers work. And it can be either or both. So for instance, Apparel Impact is a partner of Goodwill as well. We have worked with Goodwill many times in the past over the years, because they're only able to keep 15 to 20% of what you would donate to a Goodwill on average. The other 80% can't be thrown out, obviously, because of what we're talking about today. And so they work with clothing recyclers like us, to where they recycle with us, and then we work with clothing graders that can determine what the type of clothing it is, what can be reused, what can't, and then gets it into the hands of the people that can. And these clothing graders and recyclers are all across the country. So that's kind of the life cycle of how clothing recycling works. 15% of what you would donate or recycle needs to be turned into clothing, insulation into a car seat or a wiping cloth. But the other 80 to 85% can be sent to, let's say, a Goodwill in a small town in Pennsylvania that does not have enough, let's say, children's clothing. They're running out, they don't have enough donation. So they would work with a clothing recycler and say, listen, we're running out of children's clothing. It's the school year. We need 1,000 pants for both girl and boys for the school year. And so they would receive those for a small cost. They would receive them and be able to, stock up their store. So that's kind of how it works.
Sure. Now, I know in the food industry, there are, there's certification, like, going organics in the grocery store, and that some people are willing to pay 50 cents more, $1 more for food that is, certified organic, or, from a particular, good source.
Right.
And obviously there's organic clothing, but you touched on a point that we're buying more, the fast fashion, we're buying more clothing because it's not made to last. It doesn't, last a year or 3 years. Do you think that from the production side of things, that pushing a particular certification or longevity or something might help from how much we're buying and how much we need to buy, because things wear out so quickly?
The answer is yes. There's definitely a way for them to do that. And in fact, I think there are some clothing manufacturers that currently do that, where they have much higher standards as far as what textiles are used to manufacture their clothing, which in return last much longer. One company comes to mind, and don't quote me on this, but I think LL Bean might be one of them, and Patagonia might be another. With that said, those are also expensive brands. And so although that serves a certain part of the population within our country, it doesn't serve everyone. And I think that's part of the problem is a $7 new shirt for the school year. It's hard to say no to when your other options are maybe a higher quality shirt for $30 or $40. And so, yes, I think that would be beneficial, because, like I mentioned when we were talking in the presentation, even adding an additional 3 months of longevity to the piece of clothes, saves 1,000 gallons. Saves 1,000 gallons of water per year. So that alone definitely would be a solution. And we are starting to see across the world, not only in the US, but we are starting to see major clothing brands that have been accused of being a fast fashion brand start to take a little bit more responsibility of using maybe textiles that have already been used before. So they're reusing what's already been used. They're starting to use different materials, and so we are starting to see that. And I do think we are going to see an improvement of that as time goes on, and as we start talking about this and start holding people accountable.
Wonderful. I noticed that we have another question in. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection is considering a new regulation that would prohibit the disposal of clothing and textiles in landfills and incinerators. Would this be beneficial to your company?
Yes, yeah. So we have started to see a lot of towns and cities and states across the country start to consider this measure. It would be more than beneficial. This is exactly what needs to happen, because and this is what I was talking about in regards to a partnership with government. If people work within the government, this is the type of conversation that needs to be had. Because all of us, and I'm not afraid to admit it, we all need a little push every once in a while. We all need to be kind of led in the right direction. And if no one's holding our foot to the fire, we may kind of be a little lackadaisical. And
Sure.
so a regulation like what you just mentioned, where maybe the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection would prohibit the disposal of clothing and textiles in landfills, this would be the perfect solution, because then the government and companies in the recycling industry can start working together on making sure those textiles that no longer can end up in landfills can now be recycled and be put to another purpose, which in turn would create a lot of jobs. In turn, it would improve the environment big time. And so that's a perfect question, yes.
Certainly. And I find when I talk to operators, residents are always asking for, what's the story behind this? They want to know the story, the journey of the aluminum can, like how is it made? Where did it come from? I used it, for drinking, and then where's it going? What's happening again? Is it being made into another aluminum can? Where is that facility? They want to see the full picture. And I think seeing the full picture of that $7 t-shirt of what country it was made in, the conditions of the workers, the dye, the environmental impact, coming to your store, being sold for $7, and then what happens to it? Are you throwing it away? It's in the landfill. How long does it take to be biodegrade, or does it go to the reuse center, recycled,
Right.
etc. So seeing a video, a visual picture, a story of clothing would be, I think, very handy for the public, just to see. Because we just don't necessarily know all those details. Again, you're just focusing on the $7 t-shirt that you got. So
yes, yeah. And in fact, I will let this out a little bit, and don't tell anyone, whoever's on here, but Apparel Impact is actually considering writing and publishing a kid's book that could go all the way up to junior high on the life of a sock. And it goes from the manufacturing point all the way until the end of the life cycle to where it starts over again. And so I agree with you. I know that this presentation, there's a lot of data and a lot of facts and a lot of this and a lot of that, but simplistic terms of storytelling, if we can really start to talk to our children about it, I think that can also make the difference. So I'm with you on that.
Excellent. Well, as an education manager, I think that would be a great idea. I'd love to hear about it. And we're not afraid of facts and figures. That's also very supportive as well. But people are visual learners often, and it's great to just, see the story as well.
Yes.
All right. Are there any other questions from participants at this time for Joe? Okay, I'm not seeing any come in at the moment, but thank you so much, Joe, for your time. I learned a lot today, and I wanted to thank our sponsors for the summer webinar series. We would like to thank Interstate Refrigerant Recovery Incorporated, Schnitzer, and the USDA. I want to remind everyone that a post-webinar survey will launch immediately after the webinar. It'll also appear in your email inbox tomorrow. As a reminder, we welcome feedback. And coming up next in the summer webinar series, we will have Tricks of the Trade panel, Joni Cudworth, Director of Public Works in Hollis, New Hampshire, Brian Patnow, Recycling Manager in Littleton, New Hampshire, and Ed Walsh, Transfer Station Manager from Rollinsford, New Hampshire, will speak on Wednesday, September 2nd at 9 to 10 about tricks of the trade that they learn, boots on the ground at recycling facilities, how to improve things, things they've done during COVID, etc. And very much look forward to listening to them and conversing with them. But I wanted to thank you all for attending and have a happy summer from NRRA.